Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the 72nd edition of the Winter Show. We are a benefit for Eastside House, and we're thrilled to welcome you here today. I am particularly excited about this panel as we're entering our 250th anniversary. So it's very apt that we would be gathering expert panelists together on collecting the future, preserving art and heritage beyond the 250th. So I'm going to turn it over to our intrepid moderator, Danielle Amato-Milligan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Helen, for that lovely introduction. As Helen said, I'm Danielle Amato-Milligan. I'm the founder of Amato-Milligan and Associates, and I'm also the president of the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation, better known by its acronym and much easier to say, FAIC. We've got FAIC people in the audience, so very glad to have you here. I just want to say also much gratitude, right, to the panelists and also to the Winter Show for inviting us to have this panel. This came out of a relationship and a friendship that we have with the Winter Show, since the three of us here have areas of expertise that touch on everything that the show stands for. And we're happy to be at this beautiful, wonderful, important show that also benefits Eastside House. I'll be moderating today's discussion and joined by two friends and colleagues, Leila Amineddoleh, who's right next to me, and then Caroline Orr from Bank of America. So the title of our panel is Collecting the Future of Preserving Art and Heritage Beyond the 250th. Very apt topic, right? And as the literature says, as America approaches its 250th anniversary in 2026, we've got a rare opportunity to reflect not only on the art and artifacts that tell our nation's story, but on the people who safeguard them for future generations. What does it mean to be a true cultural custodian, building, growing, and protecting collections with a vision that extends centuries beyond our own lifetimes? Both of our panelists bring deep expertise to the table, and their respective fields regularly confront complex questions and situations. These are not issues that are confined to the present moment. Rather, they often extend across generations, requiring thoughtful consideration and long-term vision. Leila Amineddoleh is a partner at Tarter, Krinsky, and Drogin, where she chairs the firm's art law group. She handles both complex litigation and transactional matters related to the art market, representing artists, collectors, galleries, museums, foundations, and foreign governments. She's recognized authority on art and cultural heritage law and has lectured at the FAIC, the Victoria and Albert, the Neue Gallery, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as at academic institutions including Harvard Law, University of Geneva in Switzerland, and Yale University. She has appeared as an art law expert on television networks and business news outlets, including PBS, CNN, and the New York Times. Leila is widely recognized for her scholarly work in the area of art law, and she has contributed to dozens of publications, including the Provenance Research Handbook, which to me is pretty fascinating. Chambers and Partners and High Net Worth Guide, I love this, has recognized Leila as a leading lawyer for art and cultural property law for 4 consecutive years. In 2024, The Observer named Leila, and this is one of my favorite mentions, as one of the most influential people in the art world for her work as one of the bold innovators steering today's art world. She also currently serves as the chair of the Art Law Committee of the NYC Bar Association. Caroline Orr is a vice president and art services specialist at Bank of America in New York. Drawing on her years of experience as a specialist at Sotheby's, Caroline advises art collecting clients at all stages of the collecting journey, providing deep art historical expertise, tailored collecting strategies, and bespoke knowledge of the art market. As the dedicated specialist for Merrill clients, and I understand what that means because, full disclosure, I was part of Bank of America's consulting team and also one of the founding members of the Art Services Group. She leverages the entire suite of art services and capabilities at Bank of America, including art lending, consignment and consulting services, art planning, and philanthropic advisory. Caroline has a unique grasp on the complexities of the art world and the trajectory of the art collector's journey. As she partners with clients and their private wealth advisors, she's passionate about providing tailored advice that coalesces the emotion-driven, financial-driven aspects of art collecting. Also because she, too, comes from the art and culture space originally and is an artist herself. I'm going to start with Leila first, and then Caroline can jump in, and I know she will. People too often dive headfirst into collecting without considering important issues related to long-term stewardship, planning, and retaining the value of artwork. What are the first steps that you advise someone to take whether they're an experienced collector or a beginning collector?
When I speak with individuals or corporations, foundations, and they're interested in acquiring art, there are three topics that generally come up from a legal perspective that I know you also consider in your advisory services as well. And those considerations are title, ensuring that you actually can purchase a work legally, that there aren't any clouds on a title. That ties into provenance, which I know we'll be discussing. The second thing to consider is authentication. Is the work correctly attributed? Because clearly the identity of the artist and the attribution have a great effect on the valuation of the work. And the third item is condition, ensuring that the work is represented properly, that it wasn't conserved without disclosure. So generally, those are three of the factors as an attorney that I consider. And of course, many other factors come up, but those are, I think, the three umbrella factors that we're going to be discussing today.
Yes. Carolyn, do you want to add anything to that from your perspective?
I'll just jump in to say, I think one thing we really want to touch on today and expand on is the idea of connoisseurship and what collecting really entails. And Leila and I both, I think, expressed the same sentiment when we were discussing earlier this week, is that it's called art collecting for a reason. It's not called art acquiring, although we often use the colloquial phrase art acquisitions. But to me, the acquisition is a point in time. And really what that stands for is the moment you pay the invoice and deal with the logistics. That's just A to B. It's everything else that I think really gives this field that we are in, and the reason we're all here to talk about it today, the meaning, the passion, the emotion. That's what really gets to the heart of it. So anyway, I just want to tee up that we're going to dive deeper into why it's not called art shopping and what connoisseurship means, and some of the sort of do's and don'ts of thinking about research and doing due diligence.
Thank you. Caroline just mentioned that we did discuss how collections are highly personal and very they're financially driven, but they're also very emotionally driven. And that also applies to collecting institutions.
I actually want to take one step back, mentioning to kind of riff off of what Caroline just said about thinking of collecting or acquisitions at one point in time. And during our discussions in preparation for this panel, we discussed the fact that there are two times that we're really thinking about are acquiring, and at least as a lawyer, I break this up into two different periods of time. One is the acquisition period and kind of the buildup to that purchase when you're doing all of your homework and due diligence prior to a purchase. And the second point in time, which could be very lengthy, is after you acquire the artwork, as well as a passion purchase is also an investment that you need to continue funding. And this is one of the things that we discussed in our conversations, the long-term plans with conservation, and those three prongs still occur throughout your ownership of an artwork. And looking at the provenance, which we'll get into, the long-term provenance and how collectors can continue building that provenance over time, how they have to continue looking at attribution and the integrity of artworks, which is something that maybe we can touch upon, and also the condition, how to care for your artwork. It's a lot of expense that's involved, and there were a number of things that we spoke about in our discussions with insurance and security of art. So maybe we can talk about some of those fun cases as well. But as Caroline said, provenance, maybe that's the big word for today in building a provenance. And as a lawyer, I look at 2 points in time. And when you're looking at the provenance to ensure that there isn't, we say, a cloud on the title, that you actually have good title and can go forward with a purchase. And can mention a few interesting examples and cases. And I'm sure, Caroline, you've come across this extensively in your work. Works that have a problematic past, works that have been subject to a controversy, whether a work was stolen, perhaps looted during war, and there's a certain period of time in Europe between 1933 and 1945 where works are suspect if they don't have clear ownership. So works that may have been war looted or antiquities that were removed from a country without the proper permissions. And then other things that come up in your daily life. Husband and wife are divorcing. Who actually has the right to sell that asset? In a family, who is the heir that has permission to pass title? So all of these issues that come up between dealer partners that sell art without the other individual's permission. So for me, provenance comes up as I'm building up toward a transaction and doing that due diligence, but then continues throughout the life of ownership.
Yeah, I'll just touch on that as well. Like, I think we are in a very unique position right now with technology and tools and a lot of brain power. And now with the help of AI to bring that in, is that we have the ability to go really deep into provenance. And so in my world, I see a lot of people speculating and thinking, oh, maybe this would be a really great deal. If it seems too good to be true because you're getting a deal on something because it has a hairy past, I always suggest avoiding that, just because you may be getting a deal. The hairy past will always stay with it. And again, especially in the world we live in now. So it's kind of hard to separate anything that's been through that, that hairy provenance, I guess.
Yeah, the cloud on the title will
cloud,
always
yeah.
follow the work. And it doesn't matter if you're a good faith purchaser or there are other transactions in between the time it was stolen and when you purchase the work, that cloud will always follow the work. And Caroline, you said something really interesting during our discussions about provenance as well, which is a theme I really love about the importance of provenance being a story and how people are attracted to that story.
Well, when we think about provenance, from a very technical definition, that is a history of ownership. And you see it listed in auction catalog as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Whose hands have touched it from an ownership perspective. That's one side of it. The other side, and what I think is really propelling and driving a lot of market activity and a lot of price discovery, is the idea of provenance as narrative. It's all of that soft stuff that goes into the hands that touched it. So if you look at some of the large single owner estates that have come up at auction recently, let's just take the past 5 years. So since right after COVID, we had Leonard Lauder, we had Mika Erdogan, we had Emily Fisher Landau, we had Macklow. Who am I missing? We had Riggio at Christie's. I mean, all of these major estates were named for a reason. And if you look back maybe 15, 20 years ago, I don't think that was the case, because there was an affinity towards anonymous selling. It almost was the idea of a mystique of ownership that was somehow a cachet. But that is completely had a 180, and the idea of naming something. Let's talk about the owner, the life that they lived. We want to know the type of conversations that were happening at the dining room table, in the room where the painting hung. Like, that all of a sudden is so interesting to buyers. We live in this world, but also in a market, an art market specifically, that is being fueled by stories, by narrative, and by a lot of color, proverbial color around the history of that ownership. So yes, it is the exchange of hands in a very direct way, but it's also all of the stories. Part of that in terms of record keeping is really, having an account of how one purchased the work, how one came to, to think about a new collecting vision, because these stories are the ones that are going to be passed down to generation, and they make it meaningful to the next owner. So the documentation and the physical record keeping in and of itself, yes, important. But the stories, the motivation, the why, that is becoming so essential to keep track of.
And part of that story sometimes is the law. And as a lawyer, I love these stories where there's been a restitution or there's been a determination about who the rightful owner is. And when a collector can see a court decision and illegal decision made, it can actually help to boost the provenance as well, because collectors have more confidence in those purchases, and they know that someone isn't going to come out of the woodwork 10 years later and question that ownership.
Mhm.
But I'm very glad to see that this shift has happened, because it really is important in terms of the continuing the through line of, stewarding culture and heritage throughout, decades and generations. It's really kind of what, for me, considering my original art history background, it was always the compelling, factors. Were always the compelling factors.
Oh, exactly. And it's adding, um, an immense, like you think, I always remember the Elizabeth Taylor auction
Yeah.
at Christie's is normally cited as one of the great market moments, and how provenance and ownership drove mass intrigue. And now you see so many of these in the auction houses because of the single owner format. Like
Right.
Freddie Mercury at Sotheby's in London. I didn't get to London to see it, but I remember seeing, I don't know if anyone in the audience saw, but you see photos of the lines all down New Bond Street and Sotheby's, like wrapped around. He was selling like tissue boxes that were owned by Freddie Mercury. But that's again, it just goes back to this idea that and that's the great, what's the right way to phrase this? Like that's the great excitement around art, is that there's a gap and a delta between the sum of the parts and what someone is willing to pay for it. I remember hearing Amy Capolazzo talk about art, and she was like, sure, you can take a Pollock and rip the canvas off the stretcher bar and then take the stretcher bar apart, the nails that hold it, the cost of paint, the brush, add it all up, and it's X. And so no other industry has that sort of conceptual gap, that leap you have to take from the sum of the physicality of the parts. And all that goes in that in-between space is fascinating, right? And you have to study all, thousands of different reasons how you get to from $27 up till,
Right.
100 million, but it's there. So
Well, in both of your areas of expertise, you deal with that on different levels, right? And so I know that Leila, every case you have is different and fascinating. And you might want to give some examples, and then Caroline can give some examples of how that
Of like interesting provenance or value. And
provenance, value, or combination of all those things. I mean, you've had some really interesting.
yes, well,
Yes.
for me,
Yes.
as a lawyer, um, I look at this from a more technical side. And of course, as someone who loves art, I love these stories. And I think looking at the psychology of collectors is fascinating, that I think collectors want to have, they want to be part of the story.
Right.
Right. After you purchase something, you buy it and you flip it. Let's say a month later, your name is still in that provenance. You are still linked to that work of art. And I think that's one of the interesting aspects of collecting. And unfortunately, I do work with some people who collect art for just the financial reasons. And maybe I shouldn't say unfortunate. Everyone has a different motivation in the art market. But I do work with people who never live with their art and don't really love the art, but purchase art for financial reasons. So I think everyone does have a different motivation. But in terms of provenance, one of the cases that I worked on very early in my career involved a work that really probably wouldn't have been that valuable on its own. It was a work from, I think, 14th century Siena. The artist was unknown, but what had happened is that the work was, and this was a case that was resolved, I think, in 2015. The court order came down. But it was this work of art that was co-owned by 3 different owners, and one of the owners ended up stealing the work, changing his name, leaving the country, storing the work in a safe deposit box, and the work went missing for over 20 years. Eventually, the work came to auction. I think it was, I'm trying to remember. I think it was definitely at Sotheby's. Sotheby's recognized it as stolen because it was on a stolen art database, and the case went to court. And I represented the heirs of the two of the original owners, And ultimately, a court decision came down. We ended up settling, and each party got its third. But it really attracted a lot of attention at auction, and it went for much higher than its estimate because there was this fascination with the story, that it had gone from England, it was unknown, perhaps most likely from Siena in Italy, went to London, went to France, ended up being taken out of France illegally, brought to the United States, hidden down in Florida, and eventually made its way up to New York, where the wife of the thief ended up saying, and I can say this because it was under oath in court documents, saying, so much time had passed, I thought everyone would forget. No, you don't forget. And if there's a cloud on its title, there's always a cloud on its title. So the work ended up being given to 3 parties in equal parts. We didn't really want to sue to get that extra third back. Decided it was easier just to settle. But everyone was really interested in the story because the ultimate buyer had great provenance. And the auction catalog, it was sold at Christie's, the auction catalog noted the entire court case and that the work did have clear title to whoever purchased it. And I'm still waiting for it to show up at some point in a museum because there are some people who thought the work could have been by Duccio. But attribution is a whole other
Attribution
topic.
is a whole other thing. Yes, it is.
I mean, it makes me think of the great Maria Altman court case of the woman in
Right.
gold, the famous Clint now
Mhm.
hanging just a few blocks, several blocks north. But fascinating, and that continues to be cited as a historic precedent in restitution.
It's
Right?
a symbol for restitution.
Exactly.
And if you go into the Neue Gallery, on the walls,
Yeah.
there are 2 panels that discuss the court case. And as a lawyer, I love that. I would sometimes
Right.
bring my students to visit the museum because I think it's incredible to see our work, lawyers'
is.
works on the wall.
It is. One of the other things we talked about, how important it is for collectors and collecting institutions to have long-term planning as part of their ownership. And so what sort of experiences have you had in terms of guiding clients towards that long-term planning discussion?
I think that these planning discussions should take place at whatever price point you're at.
Mhm.
There are emerging collectors, young collectors, and I love the fact that so many institutions do engage with young collectors. And some of these institutions, like museums around New York, have these groups that introduce young people to collecting and collecting practices. So I think it's great at all price points. But when I talk to collectors about this investment in art, I always remind them that it's really long term, at least financially. They need to think of this long term because there's so many costs involved and things that people don't think about, and why people get tripped up and why people have issues with their art, whether art's damaged or art is stolen, is that they don't take care of the work afterwards. It's not just about conserving an artwork, but I think storing work safely, transporting work safely, displaying works with proper security. Even the biggest museums in the world make a mistake with security. The largest museum in the world
Yes, I
recently
know.
had a major faux pas.
There was a thing.
Yes.
But also, see, because I'm coming from the sort of, as the president of the Foundation for Advancement of Conservation, in my mind, everything you just mentioned is kind of got conservation in it as part of the long-term plan at every step of the way.
But you'd be surprised at how many collectors with really valuable collections with works, individual works valued in the tens of millions of dollars, don't think about transport. Like, oh yeah, just put that in the back of a truck.
Yes, we were
Use your
discussing that.
regular
Mhm.
movers. And that's actually where most problems come up in the art world, either with theft or damage. Damage comes up constantly.
Yes.
And it's usually in the shipping and storage context.
Mm-hmm. And Caroline, you must have, when people come to you to work with the client services group at B of A, there's all kinds of situations that they come to you with, and long-term planning must come into the discussions, hopefully
Definitely.
at an early point in the discussion.
I'll just say one of the main things that we try to encourage is when families begin thinking about collecting, it starts at the top, right? And it might seem like the kids at whatever age are too young to start being a part of that conversation, but they're never too young. And I think it's very important to consider this a multi-generational approach and through surround sound, because there will be a time when the children are making decisions, and to feel that they've been a part of that collecting journey or that it started early is incredibly meaningful. So we always encourage it to involve the next generation as much as possible. And just say on the note of conservation, one thing that I think you maybe alluded to in talking about the bank is We see our role as a cultural custodian. I did it that time. It's
Yes,
a
you did.
mouthful. To really support the longevity of an artist of an artwork's lifespan, because when we think about it, many of these works of art that we surround ourselves with, well, they will, not many, they all should and hopefully will outlive us. And to set those up for success to really outlive us and the next generation is of utmost care and importance to us. So we have an arts conservation grant. It's been around for many years now, but
Over 10.
10 because you're one of the founding
Yeah.
supporters of that. But we've helped restore some of the most iconic works of art in the world, to name Van Gogh's Starry Night at MoMA, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris when they had the fire in 2019. Those gorgeous stained glass panes in the chapelette were burned, and so we helped restore those. So it's, you wouldn't necessarily think that a bank would be involved in that type of work, but it's so important and meaningful for us.
But the other great thing about the conservation grants from Bank of America is in recent years, they've gone on to do not just the big name things, but they also do kind of obscure pieces. Like there was an obscure, when I was at the bank, there was an obscure 2nd century Roman sarcophagus that one of our clients said, I don't know, should we put the grant in? And I said, absolutely, you should. It's an important piece. And they were really hesitant about it, but the bank jumped at the chance to have that
Yes,
restored. And it's
that's-
on exhibit now
that's
with the whole story.
exactly. It's really great that you mentioned that, because oftentimes these conservation projects can be inherently tricky for whatever the medium, the scale, location, site, you name it. And so I think we're very eager to support those that are not just straightforward projects. I actually went to go see one in Miami, a Purvis Young mural that is outside in the Bakehouse region, and it has been sitting in direct sunlight, 365 days a year. And to conserve that is challenging. I think a portico was built to help, shield some of the direct sunlight to conserve it. So again, some of these more complicated projects are of great interest to us.
Yes.
So you mentioned, Caroline, the importance of involving families early on, and I
Yes.
think that's so important. And I would also like to add on, important to involve institutions in those discussions as well. And so I teach a class on art law, and just on Monday night, we were discussing this case in which a donor had this idea about where she wanted to donate her art, and she wanted to present it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the Met wasn't interested. It wasn't really at that level. And museums are not places that, people just give their art to, and museums have to take the art. The museums and institutions actually need to accept it. So I think that's part of planning, is actually having those discussions either with your trust and estate attorney, but have those discussions with the institutions to make sure you find the right home. And in this case, we were discussing the bulk of the estate was jewelry. And the art, the jewelry and a little bit of art, a couple paintings, should have probably gone to a design school or a place where they would display and actually care for that jewelry. And unfortunately, it was bad planning. The lawyer didn't find the correct place that would happily accept that donation. So I also advise collectors on that as well. It's a long-term planning. Find the right institution. Make sure you can fund that gift. Have an endowment and plan that long term. There are so many people and institutions involved in the planning.
Yes, and it also is really part of what it means to be a cultural custodian, to make sure that you are from the beginning really thinking through what is right for the art in the collection and for the potential next, the people who are going to carry it on, and also the institutions who are going to be partly the stewards.
There's a great organization, the Museum Exchange. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Museum Exchange, but think of them like maybe an organ donation matchmaking site. Someone needs a kidney, this museum wants it, this person can provide it, which is a great idea to think about, because there's so many collectors out there who wish to donate their work, but maybe are not aware that there is a museum in let's say, rural Iowa, who's looking for, and this curator has been dying for a piece by this exact artist, or that's a big part of the research of that museum, et cetera. So, that sort of, early stage research is very important.
And like not just donating works, but even loaning works, right? When you talk about the
Right.
provenance of a work, it's a way to build value in long term
course.
to actually display works at reputable institutions, have publications, and increase the value and the prestige of the work.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit more about valuation and how that factors into everything we've just been talking about, because it is very important.
I really stand by updated valuations, appraisals. I'd say the biggest thing I see on a daily basis is a big gap in understanding of purchase price, insurance value, fair market value. And without getting too far in the weeds, collectors will buy pieces at X value, and oftentimes in the initial appraisal, it is valued, quote, but really insured at that purchase price. And it's important to understand what the market value is if you're thinking about resale. So I always encourage two types of appraisals: fair market and insurance, and not just resting on the purchase price as the taken value. So that's sort of my number one thing that I try to always advocate for. But yes, updated appraisals are very important. We help our clients facilitate those for our clients, all day, every day.
And Leila, that must come into discussions you have with clients when the cases are sort of going through their different stages.
Yeah, different agreements. And when you're considering the future, if there's a dispute that comes up, what value are we looking at? And generally, we'll have like multiple appraisers, all people who are certified coming in, getting like an average of those amounts. So yeah, appraisals do come up, especially with settlements where, let's say, one party gets to keep the art and the other person will get paid out with their percentage. So valuation obviously is so incredibly important, and that often is related to the condition as well. I actually just had this come up in an agreement that I finalized today, where someone was purchasing two very large scale artworks, and they're outdoor sculptures, and the company, a corporation's actually purchasing the art, but they're leaving the artworks in place for the next 16 months. And one of the things I advise the client on is have very, very clear documentation on condition.
Yes.
Because, there are elements. What if the outdoor elements that are affecting the work? What if someone comes by and graffitis the work? What if they're not caring for the work properly? You need to have everything recorded and memorialized so that if there is an issue, we know what the value is today. We'll have to see what the future value is if there is damage. But proving that something is damaged is really hard. And I've had this come up so many times with clients, and usually in the context of the shipping and storage, where a client will send something for conservation or send something to an auction house. The auction house is planning on auctioning items. The works are in storage for those couple of months before the auction date. When they come out of storage, oops, something happened to the frame. Oops, something happened to the work. How can you prove that there was damage? So they're really simple things. They're really common sense, because you mentioned the common sense of what if it's too good to be true? And I'm always reminding clients of this: have a really clear record of everything, have your appraisals, because if there is a lawsuit, which we all hope to avoid, you need to be able to point to that valuation, and you need to prove what you had at the beginning, at the start time.
So we want to open it up now for to you all for some questions.
Caroline, the question is for you. Will you be willing to share that organ donor analysis?
Museum exchange.
And if not, email me later.
Yes. It's called the Museum Exchange.
Caroline, let's get that.
Fascinating group. Museum Exchange. Yes.
Caroline, you mentioned that you recommended having items reappraised. What frequency would you recommend?
I mean, it depends on, how often there may be movement in the collection. If it's staying in one place and you're not moving it to sell it, you're not moving it between homes, then I would say every few years is fine. It also depends on the category of collecting. If you're collecting emerging art or contemporary, where there's price discovery, appreciation, understanding those fluctuations can be very helpful. But if it's a more stable market, less frequency. And, there are different types of appraisers for different types of collecting categories. You can, of course, go the auction house route, or you can go independent appraiser route. The benefit of the latter is there's often more discretion. Sometimes collectors don't like to disclose what they have to auction houses because they don't want to be approached, have to sell, and they prefer to sort of keep it in a bit more contained, environment. And so certainly benefits of either.
As the art market is wonderfully dependent on people inheriting works of art that they don't know all the stories and the provenance sometimes, and these things come up because kids inherit things, they don't care about them, whatever, they throw it up at auction. There's something I recommend to all of my collectors, that doing a real inventory of your collection while you're alive, while you have all your faculties, because there's nobody who understands their works more than the collector. They remember the stories, the circumstances that they purchased them. They remember all of these incredible nuances that maybe the dealer shared with them or at the time of the purchase. And that information is so crucial that it's assembled in an organized way.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I tell a lot of collectors this. So I have like two different stories related to that. One involves an elderly man who's a very serious collector. And I think what he did was really, really smart. I don't know if you like this idea or not. You can give me your feedback. But he assembled information about all his artworks in a publication without prices. And then he gave the catalog to his children and said, you each get to pick, I don't know, 5 pieces each. And I guess his children could have tried to figure out some of the valuation information, and they got to pick their pieces. And then afterwards, he went to institutions and made, he really is a great planner. He made promise gifts and outright gifts. But I thought it was really interesting that he didn't want his children to be swayed just by the valuation. He wanted to make sure they actually appreciated the art. I'm also currently working with a family right now that had left Cuba, and they had an incredible art collection. And I'm going through this process with them right now with family photographs and the challenges that are involved, because when they left Cuba, they clearly couldn't bring an inventory. They weren't bringing all of that information, and trying to kind of recreate the history and to put together that inventory is challenging, very similar to families that lost property and art during World War II. But there are also wonderful researchers that can help people put together that information, and really helps evaluation of a collection. My mom, not that she's a big collector, but has some things, and she asked me to help her research. And it's always interesting doing that research, and you feel like you become, I don't know, invested in the work also once you go through that process. I think it's a great exercise for families and their children.
An emerging trend that I'm seeing is private collectors with large collections choosing to publish books summarizing their holdings on their own terms. They're not dealing with commercial publishers because they can control the narrative and make sure the photographs are of the highest quality, and they can do a private run, and they can always make more ultimately. If they go that road, are there any particular outlets that you recommend they, first of all, engage with in the process of the publication, and also place the book with certain places like the Frick Art Library, for example, so that there's a record. They're not hiding. This is not something about secrecy. It's more about trying to document on their own terms rather than put it in the hands of an auction house or a museum. Any thoughts on that?
I've seen a lot of these like self-published family chronicles of the art collection, and I love them always. And sometimes they do them for themselves, for, I don't know, holiday gifts, for friends and family. It's a great exercise, and it kind of forces you to do it. But in terms of your question, which is about strategically placing that, I don't know what exactly, any art adjacent research library such as the Frick and all of the synonyms around that would be great.
I would take those publications in some cases with a grain of salt, because I definitely worked with someone who claims these works are by certain artists, and they definitely aren't. And I've seen some of the photos, and I am not necessarily a connoisseur in some of these artists, but even I can see they weren't by that artist. So I don't know if they'd be that reputable. Like, I don't know if people would accept it. It's
Yeah,
really
you need
nice that
some sort of
that's-
stamp of approval.
Yeah.
Like you need
Yeah.
someone, but so I guess there's a
But if it's for your own personal records to say this is my
Right.
collection and I can prove it, because I also see that with an ownership issue. Like, this was in my
It is,
collection.
yeah.
Well, is it really? So I think
It's an interesting trend
I mean,
to keep an eye on.
we see so many on a daily basis. Things come across our desk, and normally they're really, really. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have the same experience. They're really, really, really long PDFs with like an analysis of the type of white paint that is used in the fleck, and that is how they know it was attributed by this person. And normally, it's like the longer that sort of argument is, the
Yeah.
the more dubious, and you can tell right away. But there are certain collectors that, because of who they are, where they purchased the artwork from. I mean, it goes back to the idea of provenance, certs of authenticity. So I guess there's two potential ways to go about that. But I'm thinking of one family in particular who's working on donating their entire collection to a major museum, and it's well documented and authenticated. And they made this book for fun, and it's great. But I could also see it going south very quickly. So
Right.
Do you ever, with your families who come to you, have them sort of speak with a conservator, sort of before they start collecting, to look through their home to see what the dangers would be, like if they have small children or animals, not putting things where balls or paws can go? Do you do that kind of thing with them to prevent catastrophes?
That's a really good question. I mean, not exactly to the point where you have a conservator go to the home, but I think being very, very thoughtful about looking at all of this potential sites of works of art before you collect, and the elements that could come into a play is crucial. So, for example, sunlight. You don't want to be a works on paper collector if you are going to have walls receiving, direct sunlight all day, every day, or live in a sunny location. Humidity is a really big thing for anything that's hinged, or works on paper, prints, photography, etc. You have to be very thoughtful about that. Often collectors will get little humidity measures. Putting works outside, you need to understand that if you're going to put works outside in a place that gets all different sorts of, seasonal rain, snow, heat, sunlight, that you need upkeep. So yes, I mean, that is very, very important. Children, and how high they can reach with a marker or pen is important. Pets, putting things behind plexi, etc. So yes, I mean, I think that's where we see all of the issues kind of come from, is maybe not having that foresight and not thinking through those questions earlier on.
I do advise clients
To have a
speak to
conservative.
I do sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've heard horror stories about, pipes breaking behind a wall. You don't want a painting on that wall. Humidity. And actually the issues we're talking about also apply to some like luxury goods or other items like musical instruments. Think
Right.
about humidity and materials and all that with violins and pianos and instruments and other types of luxury goods. But if a collector's at that certain price point, then having a conservator go in, I think might be helpful, especially if it's someone that's kind of new to the art world. It usually comes up with
Right.
someone new to the art world. Like, I'm starting a collection. I'm thinking about how to display my art. I want to keep it safe. What do I have to do?
I can tell you that my FAIC colleagues in the audience are thrilled to hear this part of the conversation become front and center, because it is really important.
I'm really appreciative that you're talking about custodians of culture, and that's custodians of care and the care of objects, and preventive conservation, which is what we just touched on now, is increasingly more important, especially if you're looking at long-term investment and value. So I was wondering if you could also touch on, when you're looking at the long-term investment and possible donation to institutions for the future care, do you also advise your clients to, when they make donations to, say, the Met or other institutions, when they accept the object, to also ensure the conservation and preservation of those objects, to provide funding to cover those costs?
I think it depends on the situation, right? There are some institutions that are there's a coveted object that they really want, and they'll be prepared to cover the conservation, the security, everything. So I think it depends on how much power you have and you're negotiating. I know that's a very lawyerly answer, but I think it really depends on how coveted that artwork is. So I have this client who has this wonderful piece, and there are a few different institutions that really want it. And he knows where he wants to send it. And I think there is a best home for it. And they're willing to offer everything, the conservation, the display that won't be in storage. And that is something I often tell clients as well, that you might want to consider a museum that maybe is a smaller museum, but that will really value it and actually have the work on display rather than knowing that it's going to spend years in storage. So I think it really is just about the power dynamic and how much you can demand from a museum.
I want to thank our two panelists and for the conversation. As you can see, art collecting is a deeply rewarding experience and one that allows both private individuals and institutions to shape a legacy and serve as stewards for arts and culture. However, with that power also comes great responsibility. Collectors and institutions must be mindful of legal obligations, the ever-shifting and evolving art market, and valuation in order to acquire and maintain notable collections to benefit future generations. Thank you, everyone,
So well
for
said.
being here.